Today we're going to learn about modern theories of economics, and some of these are actually not maybe so modern after all. They have their roots in the early part of the 1900s even, and some of them are in the middle of the 1900s, but they kind of form the different poles, the different spots where people might fall in general. And it might be important to say at the outset that nowadays most people economists anyways, wouldn't identify as Keynesian or necessarily monetarist or Austrian typically. They would be neo-Keynesians, neo-monetarists, and there's some neo-Austrians out there. And in other words, these theories have evolved over time. And what I'm going to try to do in this very short video is give you kind of the basics of what these different philosophies believe about stabilization, because that's what our entire unit is about, is how do we stabilize that business cycle when we say we have an upward trend of growth and around it there's a business cycle. And so we'd say over time we would like Y to increase, output to go up, but over time we also notice that it fluctuates. So three different kind of schools of thought about this. First is something known as the Austrian school, and this is actually from a man named Friedrich Hayek. And he's not the originator by any means, but he's probably one of the most well-known economists of the Austrian school. Friedrich Hayek, or F.A. Hayek, believed, like many Austrian economists of the day, and that was why it was kind of named, that the business cycle happens because of asset bubbles. And what do we mean by this? We mean overvalued speculative items. So people are buying houses, for example, and they bid them up in prices and they sell them to someone else at a profit, and then someone else buys it and tries to make it to sell it to someone else at a profit. We also see asset bubbles in things like stocks. We often sometimes see it in bonds, for example, or commodities markets like raw materials. So anything can have an asset bubble. In fact, one of the most famous ones was the Tulip Bubble, right, of the Holland in the 1600s. But the business cycle happens because of these, and these bubbles are often actually caused by government picking winners and losers, by government interventions. And that, in fact, the way that we could avoid all of this up and down, is avoid interventions. Because if we do that, if we especially intervene to try to address the business cycle interventions, that will actually choose the winners and losers, and the seeds of the next recession are planted during the previous one. In other words, when governments are trying to fix something, what they're actually doing is planting the seeds for the next one. Some of the issues or criticisms of it would be is that it doesn't endorse any kind of stabilization policy that the government has, and so it has to accept maybe the downside, right? The recession periods as well as the upsides, the expansions. And so this isn't necessarily always very appealing to political policymakers and things like that, because it basically says wait it out. Now, the second major kind of theory of modern economics is from John Maynard Keynes, J.M. Keynes. And Keynes, who we've talked about a lot in this class, is really responsible in many ways for the development of modern macroeconomics. His belief was that consumption and investment are the major determinants of output and growth, that how much we produce is determined by, in particular, these two factors, how much consumers buy and how much businesses spend on machinery and equipment. And his argument is that if we have fluctuations in how much people are consuming and investing, that we should use the tools of government to address those. Now, this may sound like he doesn't have a reason for why the business cycle happens, right? Because the Austrians have this reason that says, well, the business cycle happens because of government interventions. Keynes actually gave it a name. He said that the reason that consumption and investment, the reason they fluctuate, can be something as enigmatic as animal spirits. He said that sometimes people are just moved by animal spirits, and the market sometimes just gets out of whack. That stuff happens is kind of a way to say that. You know, when we're living right now through a global pandemic, there's a reason why consumption and investment fall. Keynes's argument was we should use fiscal policy to address them, and we should implement regulations to prevent the asset bubbles and speculation. In other words, we should not be picking winners and losers. He was cognizant of this criticism that the first school has, and he said, well, we should regulate and avoid that from happening. This does have its own set of issues. Typically, it generates higher deficit spending, and that can lead to crowding out. So, and this is, if you remember, the decrease in investment spending. Now, the third school is one that we haven't really learned about in this course so far, but it's pretty important. It develops in the middle part of the 1900s, in the 1960s and 70s, and it was through two economists, Anna Schwartz, and Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman, who is in particular, Friedman more than Schwartz is a hero on the right to many in the conservative world. In some ways, as many as Keynes is on to the left. Friedman and Schwartz argued that the money supply is actually a major determinant of output and growth, and indirectly that the supply, the aggregate supply curve, is as well. So this can be sometimes extended to say aggregate supply, sometimes. So I'm going to put a little question mark there, aggregate supply. But in general, they argue that it's actually money supply that's the biggest determinant of output and growth, and that in fact that we have this view that monetary policy, that's what these two would say, is a really important aspect of this. The argument here is that that the quantity theory of money, and this is a little bit cattywampus to understand, but it's abbreviated here, M times V equals P times Y. Now the M is the supply of money. So there's some supply of money out there, and V equals the velocity of money. Now that sounds a little strange here. It's how many times, the number of times a given dollar is spent in a year, we'll say, in a time period. And so that's a T, in time period. So if you take the money supply and you multiply it by the number of times that the given dollar is spent in a given time period, and maybe if we said it's in a year, that equals P times Y. Now P is equal to the price levels or prices in the economy. The prices of all the goods and services in the economy. So we could also just say price levels. And Y is output, the amount of stuff, the literal amount of stuff, not the dollar value, but the actual amount of the stuff. And so this argument is that output, the amount of stuff that we produce, basically stays the same in most cases. Prices, right, can change. Prices are relatively flexible, and then these two, if you multiply these two together, you get, right, GDP, and this is nominal GDP is equal to P times Y, like, because that's the prices of the stuff times the amount of the stuff, that's nominal GDP. And so Schwartz and Friedman observed that if you change the supply of the money, right, the velocity, they also said, is a constant. So I'm going to add that here and say this one's relatively constant, and output is relatively constant. I mean, even in a really nasty recession, you might only see 4 or 5% declines in the amount of output that we produce. So what they observed is that if you change the supply of money and the velocity is constant, the output is constant, then the only thing that's going to come out on the other end is changes in price levels. And that in fact, that we really actually don't need to intervene very much to address the business cycle. But instead, if we increase the money supply at a steady rate corresponding with the growth in potential GDP, then we can actually avoid having these ups and downs. And in fact, their observation was that why recessions and expansions happened was because of large changes in the supply of money. And they basically said that in the 1800s and before the Fed in the 1920s and 1930s, we had this gold standard and the silver standard for a while, and that we had bimetallism, where we had both a gold and a silver standard. And they said the changes that were happening in the supply of money when we had the gold standard and the silver standards were actually causing these boom and bust cycles. And that what we ought to do to smooth all of that out is to avoid huge interventions, and that in fact the business cycle will kind of smooth itself out. And that this is why, is because basically if you keep the supply of money increasing at say 2% a year, then your prices will just increase 2% a year, and output will naturally rise as a result over time. It'll be kind of a slow change in that constant. Now the issues. One is the money supply actually became really hard to calculate starting in the 1990s, and even today it's even harder. I know that sounds a little strange that we don't know how much money there is, but think about the different M's, right? We have monetary base, which we can easily calculate. That one's easy, right? So I'm going to say easy because you can count how much is in the reserves and how much currency there is. But then you have M1. Kind of easy, kind of. Because M1 is everything that's M0, which is the currency. You can count that, kind of, right? You can pretty much know how much currency there is. And how much is in checking accounts? Well, checking accounts are a little bit harder, right? You have to actually monitor them. Now, then you have M2, which is not so easy. Not easy to calculate. Like we have a definition, but oftentimes the amount of money that's in savings accounts and money market accounts and things like that fluctuates quite a bit. So we find that it's just very difficult overall to calculate kind of that money supply. The other last thing is that one of the issues is that there's been a significant decrease in money velocity. And in fact, that kind of breaks one of the rules here. That over the last 20 years or so, we've seen a real drop in money velocity. And that there's a lot of interesting research about why that is. But that makes the connection between the money supply, the M side, and the nominal GDP side less strong. In other words, if there's a drop in money velocity and we increase the supply of money, then that actually could leave the prices the same. Or if we keep the money supply the same, another way to say that, you keep the money supply the same, but if the velocity drops and the output stays the same, then prices will drop. And so there's an argument that maybe the decrease in money velocity is causing lower levels of inflation over the last 20 years or so. So anyways, these are kind of the big picture overviews of the major kind of schools of thought. Most of this is going to be appearing on the AP exams in some fashion, in particular this bad boy. So put a star next to MV equals PY. I've seen one or two multiple choice questions every year that show up from that. And it basically is like, okay, the velocity is constant, the money supply goes up. What happens to nominal GDP? Well, it's not hard if you know MV equals PY. Velocity stays the same, supply of money goes up, so that means nominal GDP, or PY, has to go up. All right, I'll see you next time.